So my name is Fraser Matthews. I'm Global Brand Ambassador for Bruichladdich Distillery based on Islay. I'm actually based at the distillery. I grew up on the island and I'm very fortunate enough to have called Islay my home for the past almost 28 years. And I'm here to talk to you today specifically about Bruichladdich. So we are of course a distillery operating on the island. We're one of now 10 working whisky distilleries on the island. So to say that Islay is a mecca for whisky production is really quite an understatement. Now there is a specific style of whisky that Islay in particular is synonymous with, and that is a very peated, very intense, very smoky style. We at Bruichladdich though offer something a little bit different while still giving those peat heads exactly what they're looking for. We make 3 different styles of whisky. Those are broken down into our Bruichladdich range. So anything with Bruichladdich on the bottle, which actually makes up a majority of what we produce at the distillery. Anything with Bruichladdich is completely unpeated. So you won't find there to be any smoke or any of that peaty flavour in the Bruichladdich whisky whatsoever. We also make a spirit called Port Charlotte. So Port Charlotte is essentially the name given to peated Bruichladdich whisky. It comes in at a middle of the road level of 40 parts per million on the peating scale. And then we have Optimore, which, speaking of the peating scale, isn't on the peating scale. It completely blows it out of the water. Super heavily peated, the most heavily peated whisky series on the planet. So today I'm going to talk to you all a little bit about these 3 products in a bit of depth. We're going to do a little tasting of these, and then I can talk to you about these 3 as well, but I've been told I'm not allowed to open these ones unless Jose pays, which he doesn't want to do. So we'll start off with the Classic Laddie. I did have a dram of it here, but it's just been taken from me. Maybe I can have yours? You keep an eye on this guy. So the Classic Laddie is very much our distillery's flagship whisky. It's the one that you find most widely available of ours, and really it's the one that allows us to do all the really cool experimental stuff that we do at the distillery. As our flagship product, it's incredibly important to us that for people tasting our whisky for the first time, if this is indeed the first impression that they have of our distillery, we want the classic flavours of Bruichladdich to be highlighted in the best way that we can. So our head distiller, a man called Adam Hannett, his job is to create all of these amazing whiskies for us, but he is looking to really bring together multiple ages of spirit, multiple types of cask, multiple origins of barley, to combine all of those together and to best represent the house style of the distilling. So straight away, when you nose this whisky, it doesn't really fit the stereotype or the style of a whisky produced on Islay. And again, if you want to reduce Islay to the smell or to the taste of a whisky, which I'm not someone who generally does that, but if you do that, you would assume that this is not an Islay whisky, right? Because it doesn't have that smoke, it doesn't have that peat in there at all. That doesn't mean that this is less of an Islay whisky or that it isn't an Islay whisky. In fact, we are we're the only major distillery on the island to mature and bottle all of our whisky on site. And there's also a percentage of locally grown barley that makes up this particular batch, and most batches of Classic Laddie that are on the market. So through this assemblage of different components that makes up each bottling of the Classic Laddie, we're working with different things every time. So again, Adam, who I mentioned earlier, our head distiller, he doesn't have the easy job of just following a recipe that was laid down by someone before him or by generations before him. He's having to essentially create a new batch, a new vatting, a new recipe every single time he's called upon to. Now what that means is that there are slight and subtle differences with regards to what components are brought together to produce each batch of the Classic Laddie. And what that also means is there can sometimes be a slightly different colour and an ever so slightly subtle difference in flavour or in nose from one batch to the next. That's because we are not looking to make exactly the same thing every single time. We are looking to meet the key house style of the distillery. So it will always be light, it will always be floral, it will always be really, really elegant, and again, it will always be identifiably Bruichladdich spirit, and of course completely unpeated. We always bottle this at 50% ABV. That for some consumers can be a little bit overwhelming or perhaps a little bit daunting. And in a lot of cases for a spirit of such a high ABV, you can find that there might be a little bit of a burn or a harshness, certainly, when you drink that particular spirit. With Bruichladdich though, we like to say that it comes across more so in a really lovely, oily, viscous texture, that when you taste it, just coats your palate, and that means that flavour will stay with you and will subtly evolve as it reacts with your saliva and stays on there again in your palate. So without further ado, cheers. So again, despite that 50% ABV, there's none of that harshness going down. I can feel those oils right now. I'm going to spend the next, so many minutes talking, and as I'm doing that, those oils and my saliva are going to be mixing together, and that flavour is going to subtly change and subtly evolve as time passes. And that makes this an incredibly complex whiskey with an amazing depth of flavour. So the Classic Laddie, just to round it up, is a non-age statement whiskey. So this is a multi-vintage. It consists of lots of different gauges of spirit and types of cask married together. And it is one with an ongoing and ever-changing recipe that is determined by one person, our head distiller, Adam Hannett. Now, on each bottle of the Classic, there's a batch code in very, very small writing in the bottom of the bottle at the back. Now, we're a distillery who likes to champion transparency and believes that consumers should have the right to know everything about what they are spending their money on. And so you can type this batch code into our website. You just need to go onto bruichladdich.com, click on the Classic Laddie section, and type that into the search bar on there, and we'll give you a full breakdown of each of these single components that have been combined together to make the specific batch that you're consuming. Because a whiskey like this that is always available, it's a finite product. It is a batch process, and as I say, each batch will be slightly different. So that's the Classic Laddie. Next up, we're going to be tasting the slightly newer than the Classic. This was a bottling that was released just last year, and this is the Bruichladdich 18-year-old. So this, similarly to the Classic, is a product that will always be available. It's not a limited edition. It's not here now and gone in a year's time. This is one that's going to be consistently available, and in that regard follows a similar framework to the Classic Laddie in that it's a batch process. Adam will have to create a new batch every time. He of course will be working with minimum 18-year aged spirit when he creates these batches, and again, what he really wants to do is make sure that that house style and that those key flavours are still present in the 18s, even after the extra time that this is spent in the casks over the Classic Laddie hats. So for those of you that want to take part, you'd like to spit the lot as well. So for this particular vatting or the components of this bottling of the 18-year-old, we're working with predominantly ex-bourbon casks. So bourbon forms a really good foundation, a really good basis from which we can then begin to do a little bit of experimentation at Bruichladdich. It's also a cask type that won't overpower or won't take over from the quality of the spirit itself. So as I said, we do very much want there to still be that really identifiable, typical Bruichladdich house style to be present in this 18-year-old whiskey. So this is around 90% ex-bourbon casks, and the other 10% is made up of a combination of Sauterne casks, so dessert wine from France, as well as port casks. What they tend to bring to the table is a little bit of fruitiness, a bit of a different style of sweetness to the bourbon casks, just to add a sprinkle of something a little different, a wee change to the complexity on the finish. So I mentioned a little bit early on how we're a distillery that actually uses barley that is grown locally to Islay. In fact, the first barley that was grown on Islay for almost a century was grown for Bruichladdich in 2004. It was the first time since pre-Second World War that barley had been grown on Islay for distillation purposes. And actually, this batch of the 18-year-old contains some of this first spirit to have been distilled from that first Islay barley grown and as such a historic moment for the island. So there's a lot of history in this dram, as well as just the 18 years age between those or that plethora of different casks. Again, 50%, but not dominating your palate, just giving you that really nice, oily, viscous texture. What the Islay barley tends to bring to this, because the grain has been grown so close to the sea, is a little bit of a coastal maritime influence, which again really does stand the test of that 18 years aged in the casks in a quite pleasant and rather surprising way. I'm going to take another sip. That's good. So moving away from the Bruichladdich, moving away from the unpeated, we can now taste the latest in the cask exploration series of Port Charlotte. This is actually the 7th bottling in that series, and the premise of the series is essentially to focus on some of the amazing cask types that we're working with at Bruichladdich. We're a distillery that's particularly experimental with the casks that we bring in. We actually have over 300 different categorizations of types of casks within the warehouses, and that's something that we're really proud of. We're not a distillery that wants to make the same thing over and over again. We want lots of different possibilities, because then there's the chance to make something amazing every single time. So this release follows the same coding system as the previous ones have done, but this time it's called the SYC. So what that means is that this was matured, or we spent some time in ex-Syrah wine casks, Syrah being the old world wine term for the Shiraz grape. Very full-bodied, very intense flavour of the wine, and I think that really comes across well in the whiskey, but it is complemented really well by the peat smoke that's in the Port Charlotte. So the maturation profile of this one, it spent an initial 5 years in first fill bourbon casks. It then went into the Syrah casks for 4 years before going back into second fill bourbon casks just for 1 year, to allow a little bit of balance to be retained in the spirit. When using a cask or a cask type I should say, as intense as a Syrah cask, you can have a possibility of the cask beginning to dominate and really overpower a lot of those other flavours. So Adam just wanted to draw that back a little bit, and that was the logic behind putting that back into the second fill bourbons. The wine producer that the casks were previously used by is based in the Rhone Valley, and they're known for having a fairly similar ethos to Bruichladdich. They have a particular impetus on producing organic and biodynamic wines, and have a similar approach to sustainability as we do here. So it's always nice to collaborate with like-minded companies in different parts of the world and making a very different product. So, do you want to have a little try?
Let's do that.
You guys? I know Sam was interested in this one, but he seems to be on his phone that we're a little. Yeah? You can take some of me. We'll sort you out. You can have this one. I'll phone this up. I like this one too much to. So I think the first thing you notice, and I think everyone's guilty of it, rightly or wrongly, but you judge a whiskey first of all with your eyes, and you can very clearly see the influence from the wine casks in this one is very strong. On the nose, for me, the smoke isn't as prominent off the bat as it is perhaps in some of the other Port Charlotte range. It's when you taste it, that's when I think it really comes to the fore. And again, when you've got such strong flavours between the Syrah and that peat smoke, it creates for me a battle in your palate for which of those flavours will come out on top and will be the dominant flavour. But that works really well as a harmony. So cheers.
There's I can pops agenda. Like it brings the actual gate. I saw it in the actual gate.
So this one comes in at
It's fine.
54.4% ABV.
Well, okay.
So it's not quite cask strength, but the ABV for this has been very, very carefully selected by our head distiller Adam. He will basically take the spirit from the casks. He'll taste before he does the batting for the bottling. He'll basically do everything on a small scale, and once it's ready to be bottled, that process will be scaled up. When it comes to the ABV, he's very deliberate in incrementally adding tiny drops of water to the samples until he finds his sweet spot. And he has deemed this 54.4% to be the sweet spot for this particular bottle. I see lots of nodding going on over there. I think that is a good sign. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. Now we don't, as I say, don't have these for pouring, but just to briefly talk you through these. This is essentially the predecessor of the one that you're tasting now. So the PMC preceded the SYC and was the 6th release in that cask exploration series. PM stands for Pomerol, so the wine cask used to finish and influence this whiskey came from Pomerol, which is of course the sub-region of Bordeaux, known for making some of the best wines in the world. This one's 54.5%, so it's 0.1% above the SYC, but another really good one to add to the collection. You then have the Port Charlotte 18-year-old 2nd edition. The first edition came out last year, funnily enough. There are only 8,000 bottles of this one, so it's in really, really limited numbers. And this one is unbelievably good. Matured in a combination of bourbon and sherry casks. Again, same peating level across the board. Port Charlotte is always a consistent 40 ppm. And again, when you see that Port Charlotte name on a bottle, just think peated Bruichladdich. That's the simplest way to think about it. Port Charlotte is also the name of a small village just a couple of miles away from the village of Bruichladdich, where the distillery is located. That doesn't mean that Port Charlotte whiskey is made there. It's purely the name of the peated brand to pay homage to that village, to that location. And speaking of locations, not far from Bruichladdich, Octomore, which is the name of our super heavily peated whiskey. Not a lot of people know this, but it is also the name of a farm, and that farm is located just right alongside, actually, the village of Port Charlotte. So each of the 3 brands are named after 3 different locations on the kind of west, southwest tip of Islay. We began making Octomore in 2002, and actually even Port Charlotte is in whiskey terms and in Scotch terms a relatively young brand. We started making this in 2001. Octomore came about very much as a what if idea. What if we take a super heavily peated malted barley and run it through our tall, narrow-necked stills that we have at the distillery that are designed to make a very light, floral and, elegant style of spirit. What started off as a what-if idea has grown to be quite popular within the Scotch whisky world, to say the least. It has a bit of a cult following. And despite the really high peating levels of the Octomores, for example, this one's 108 ppm, but it doesn't necessarily come across that way when you taste it. So this particular bottling is the 15.2. We have a numbering system that we use at Octomore, which does actually, believe it or not, have logic and reason behind it. So we are now in the 15th annual release of Octomore. Those tend to be brought out in the fall. And within each release, we will have at least 3 different bottlings: the 0.1, the 0.2, and the 0.3. So they're not here right now, but the 0.1 is always matured exclusively in bourbon casks, and I always say to people that that's the perfect way to have that introduction to Octomore. The 0.2, like this one here, is where we do a little bit of experimentation with casks. So the 0.2 will always have some form of European oak cask influence. In the case of this one, this is matured in a combination of bourbon casks and also cognac casks. Then we have the 0.3. The 0.3 is actually particularly special for me, being from Islay, because the barley was grown on the island as well. So not only was it grown on Isla, but the barley for all of the 0.3 editions of Optimore was actually grown on Optimore Farm, which kind of makes it that super, super high provenance, single farm, single vintage whiskey, which is, again, a level of provenance that you don't see too often in the Scotch world. The number of people that have come up to me in the past and said that they don't like peated whiskey, and have then kind of slyly, without them necessarily knowing, given them an Optimore and it being something that they've really enjoyed, like I say, you'd be surprised at how many times that's been the case. So I often think people get put off by the numbers, and I think when selling it and when I talk about it, I tend to leave the numbers out a little bit. I certainly don't put them at the forefront, because for anyone that's remotely knowledgeable about whiskey, you tell them three things. You say, number one, it's 5 years old, so it's pretty young in whiskey terms. It's usually around 60% ABV. It's bottled at a much higher strength. And again, you're talking about astronomically high levels of smoke. And typically, any whiskey that has one of those three characteristics, that one characteristic is going to dominate that whiskey, or certainly you could argue that it would. So a whiskey having all three of those is like, in your head you think, well, this isn't going to be something that's drinkable, and then you taste it and it just defies all reason and defies all logic. So yeah, that's the end of the training. Thank you for watching and listening and tasting along. And yeah, hopefully see you all soon.